So tonight, I thought we would just make our way through the last week of the Lord's life. We go through it every year. We probably know the various parts of it, but on that piece of paper that's there at the back, we'll just sort of walk through it and remind ourselves of the events of this particular week and some of the things that happened, and there may be some things that you want to discuss or talk about as we make our way through it. So we begin obviously on one way on Sunday, but the previous Saturday, as John tells us, was when the Lord Jesus was at a dinner in the home of Simon the leper, and Mary and Lazarus and Martha were there, and Jesus was anointed by Mary, infuriating Judas and the rest of the disciples joining into that, and then the Lord making that statement, "She's done a good thing to me. What will be told in the whole world, she's anointed my body for burial," and just some of the wonder of all of that particular event. I don't know, it's interesting that Jesus, I don't know what pilgrims would do. So even as I mentioned it last Sunday, he was clearly there on the evening of Sabbath in this dinner party. He'd come up from Jericho, and I don't know whether pilgrims were required not to travel on the Sabbath or whether they got a festival exemption on some particular way. So either he had come up on Friday from his encounter with Zacchaeus, or it was on Saturday he came up and then went to this meal. We just don't know the details of that. Sunday, we've talked about last Sunday, and the events of that are relatively straightforward. As we looked at last Sunday, it begins in Bethany. The Lord goes along the ridge of the Mount of Olives to Bethphage, and there he gives the instructions to his disciples that lead into the triumphal entry, as we call it. And in the process, the Lord comes at some point breaking into tears and weeping over Jerusalem. If only you'd known in this day, the day of your visitation. And there's that sort of exuberance of the crowds, and yet the weeping of Jesus in the midst of this over the recognition that judgment is going to fall upon the city because of the events that are going to come that day. And undoubtedly, there's some thought of his own impending death and all that's involved in that. He comes into the temple area, he looks around, and then we're told in Mark, he leaves and he goes back up to Bethany and spends the evening with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Apparently, we're not specifically told of that location, just that he was up in Bethany where his friends were. And then on the next day, he comes back again to Jerusalem. And Luke tells us he was in the temple daily. So each day of this week, apparently, obviously not Friday, but he comes and he's in the temple and he's teaching in the temple courtyard. On the way down, there is the fig tree where he goes to get figs from it, and he finds that it doesn't have figs at that particular point. The early figs, there were two kind of times of figs, early figs, late figs. There were sort of the preliminary ones, and he curses the fig tree. And that's a symbolic act talking about his judgment on the nation of Israel, which was often represented, and the coming judgment is what he'd wept over the day before, that judgment is coming to Israel. And then on the other side, he gets to Jerusalem and he cleanses the temple. Goes into the temple courtyard, not into the temple proper, turns over the tables that are there, chases out the money changers and the animal sellers. And then you've turned my father's house into a den of thieves, and complains that it's all been commercialized and turned in that particular direction. So that's a symbolic action as well. He is claiming to be the Lord of the temple, who was doing his Father's business to purify the temple. So those two symbolic acts that I don't know that the disciples understood the symbolism of it. One, that Israel is now going to come under divine judgment because of their rejection of Christ, and that comes up again, especially on Tuesday of this week, and then on in the cleansing of the temple, and of course, in doing that, he's infuriated the temple rulers, leaders, business people, and all of those kind of things, because all of that selling and the temple and so forth is under the auspices of the temple. They're making money from it, and he has upset the business at that end. So it is another, as it were, bullet in the gun in terms of their dealing with Jesus. And then Tuesday becomes the big day of the week in many ways. It is the day that most of the account of the week that's given is given to. And just to kind of remind us and to walk our way into it, he teaches the lesson of the fig tree, because he comes to the tree and they say, look how it is withered already, and this has happened to it. Teaches them something about it at that stage. Then he comes into Jerusalem, and you have this series, the day of controversy, and they come on in waves. The Pharisees, the scribes, the Sadducees, all of the religious leaders come together. They all have their own issues with Jesus, but they come in to do everything they can to discredit him publicly, and he keeps turning all of the questions against them. So they start in this particular way, and they think they're going to catch him, and he inevitably turns it around the other way. And then at the end of that, it turns around, and he begins now to speak to them very directly of all that they have done in terms of their disobedience to him. And so you have Matthew chapter 23, which is an excoriating passage, and we tend not to read that one through, where Jesus declares his woes upon the Jewish religious leaders for all of the ways in which they are hindering God's work. Somewhere in there, and actually it's put at the end of Matthew chapter 22, so it may have been before he did that excoriation, although Matthew arranges things topically, you can't be sure. He also sees this widow woman who's putting in money, and he gives that whole little talk in terms of her giving, that she's given more than all the rest because they've given out of their abundance. She's given everything she's had. And then they leave the city, they go up on the Mount of Olives, where they can look back on the temple. The disciples make their statements about, look at the size of this and all of this, and Jesus then says, not one stone is going to be remaining standing on another. And we have the sermon that is often called the Olivet Discourse, as Jesus talks about the coming destruction, the return of the Lord Jesus as king, and then a series of parables that are related to that. Some of them we looked at when we looked at our studies in the parables. So that brings us to today. And today, in terms of the gospel specifically recording, we're not told of anything that happened directly that Jesus was involved in, although Luke says he was in the temple daily teaching, so perhaps he was in the temple. What we do know in this particular day is that they had a meeting of the Jewish leadership following up what had happened the day before, and they determined to kill him, and they are going to kill him before the Passover. And in the process of that, they make the arrangement with Judas that he will betray him. So somehow he's come to them, or they've discovered his willingness, and there is an arrangement made, and the signal is made. And so the plot is put into place on Wednesday for what will happen as it happens to be the next day, as far as we can put all of the details together. So it is on one level a quiet day, but it's a quiet day. It's the quiet before the storm of what is going to happen when everything breaks out in its fullness on Thursday. So let me just stop there and see if there's any observations or things that are specifically important to you about these days that we've gone over fairly quickly, and things that we should notice or consider or discuss a little bit, just to try and think through that more clearly.
Well, this is probably a yes or no question, but reading through the prophets and reading through the Old Testament, would they not have had a clue if the people are calling Jesus the son of David, and the people are listening, the regular run-of-the-mill Jewish person's listening, and the leaders here, would they not care to see how the Old Testament is being fulfilled? I mean, are they that ignorant?
Would who not want to?
Well, the leaders, because he'll say to them at some point, you err because you don't know the scriptures. And if you read the scriptures, you can, I mean, even all the things about Isaiah, if they had taken time to look into Isaiah's 9:6 or other things he says about him, they would get a clue. Didn't they know the scriptures? I mean, the scriptures are being fulfilled all the time with...
Yeah, but their mind was so set that it's the same thing that happened when, the beginning of the Lord's life. The Magi come from the east. Where is he who's going to be born king? They call them in. They can say, well, Micah prophesied it in Micah 5. It's going to be in Bethlehem.
Yeah.
And then they go away. They don't. They
I just
know
can't figure it out.
They know the structure, but their mindset is an entirely different place.
Yeah.
And even in after Lazarus is raised from the dead, and there's this furor about it, they have a gathering and they say, Caiaphas gets up and says, don't you know what's going to happen? If we don't deal with this man, the Romans are going to come and take away our place and our people. So all they are thinking about is that they're so focused on protecting their privileges and protecting their way of life and their pattern of life that they've closed their ears to hear. Now, obviously, some did, because you have Joseph of Arimathea and you have Nicodemus doing what they're going to do later. But they are apparently, Nicodemus makes some attempt to try to slow them down, but it doesn't have any effect.
One more thing related to that. Okay, so then they were expecting another prophet like Moses, because Moses says that in Deuteronomy, that there's another prophet like me. In the verses in Isaiah 53, where they might have still been reading it compared to now, they would have seen there was a death, a bloody death, and that sort of thing. And then when they actually do put him to death, they're the ones that fulfill the actual prophecy of him being crucified. And they just didn't get it. It's just so sad.
It's very hard to know what the Jews of that time thought about Isaiah 53, because most of the Mishnah and the Talmud was put together after the destruction of Jerusalem. Oh. And they knew what Christians were making of that passage, so they aren't going to read it, and it's very hard to know what they would have said prior to all of these events. But what they were focusing on, and clearly, it's there in the triumphal entry, right. They were looking for a king who was going to deliver them politically. Yeah. That's the people, that's the ones who have a heart for those things. Right. But the rest, they were just focused on protecting their privilege. So the theological questions, it's interesting that they'll gang up with people with whom they have total disagreement with. So Pharisees and Sadducees saw the world entirely differently. One believed in the resurrection, the other didn't believe in the resurrection. One believed in all of the Old Testament writings. The Sadducees believed just in the Torah and those kind of things. And they put all of those things aside. So you take your shot at them, we'll take our shot at them. As long as we can discredit him, we don't care who does it. So
Okay, so one more thing then. When we watched, the Psalms study group watched Jerusalem, City of Tears, Jerusalem, City of Hope, and the fact that the history of the Jewish nation is to get into idolatry, even apostasy, and then be so distressed they call for help. And then God is faithful. Psalm 107 was the one we studied last week, not this week. And so then when we watched Dr. Rydelnik's video, he made a big point of saying it isn't until they cry for help during the time of the time of Jacob's trouble that they are finally going to call for help from the Lord, and that's when he's going to come and they're going to mourn on him whom they pierced, that sort of thing. And they're basically, somebody asked me, isn't it a shame that for this many years, 2,000 years, generations of Jewish people have come and there's just been that simple, tiny little remnant that has believed, and the whole nation has not. And then when they come to the end of themselves again, is that kind of the way it is with us? With not us, but with human nature, you have to come to the end of yourself and then you finally call in the name of the Lord. It's just sad. I mean, I feel sad for it, but anyway, it's got hope.
Anything else we should think about? Well, let's talk about Thursday then. So Thursday, we don't know. Again, on my thing I put here, teaching in the temple. Did he go back and teach in the temple, especially after the controversy of Tuesday, Wednesday? Anyway, I'll go by what Luke says. He said he was teaching daily in the temple, so that's entirely possible. Somewhere along the way, he gives instructions to the disciples about preparing for the Passover, and you remember that, to go, and they would find a man with carrying water on his head, which is a very unusual thing for a man to do in Jewish culture at that particular time, so it would stand out like a red flag. Or maybe a red MAGA hat on a university campus, you would notice it very quickly at that particular point. And he gives instructions, they prepare, and late afternoon, evening, he would go to the upper room and they would have the meal with the disciples in the upper room. So this day gets known as Maundy Thursday, which has always struck me as strange. I mean, I wasn't brought up with those kind of titles for things, but I think Maundy is a reference to foot washing, if I remember properly, but I may remember wrongly. I meant to look it up and remind myself again. But when Jesus washes the disciples' feet, and then we remember the rest of what happens, he has the discourse, which we have so much of in John, from John chapter 13 to John 13 to 17. Somewhere in there, probably very close to the beginning, we have the Lord talking back and forth, and Judas departs. And it was in the course of the meal that he departed. Whoever dips with me in this sup is going to betray me. And then the discussion goes on. You remember the Lord says, what you're going to do quickly, and he leaves. My inclination, but it's purely an inclination, there's no biblical certainty, is that would have happened before he inaugurated the Lord's Supper. But I can't prove that. But if Judas was gone, at that point the Lord begins to talk more clearly about his death, having already said, one of you is going to betray me, and you remember how that discussion goes back and forth. And again, and this is a different issue than you were talking about, Elizabeth, but the same issue of the disciples who knew so many things. And it's interesting that even in the triumphal entry, John makes the point that, and he quotes Zechariah 9, and then he says, the disciples didn't understand this, Zechariah 9, until after he'd been risen from the dead. So all of it was coming at them so fast that they could not put it together. And Jesus tells them he's going to betray them. For Peter, someone's going to betray him. For Peter, that's unthinkable that he's going to die, and they have all of those discussions. In the midst of it, he institutes the Lord's Supper. And I was reading something today, and I thought the person put it interestingly. He said, you know, when you come to the Lord's Supper, you need to look in 5 ways. You need to look up because it's the Lord's table. He's the one who is there. You need to look in. Let each person examine himself. You need to look back, and you're looking to the cross and what Christ has done then. You need to look around because one of the sins that was occurring in 1 Corinthians 11 was that people were not respecting the body, and in that sense it was related to their fellow believers, and they were not behaving rightly to them. And then you need to look ahead, because we do this till he comes. And it's a kind of interesting way of sort of remembering fairly quickly, look up, look in, look back, look around, and look forward. And all of those things are part of what he was saying. We were listening to a song just as we came in today, and he was talking about as we come to the table, we come to remember and proclaim. And that's another part that we do. And then we have the rest of the upper room discourses. Jesus now begins to talk very directly about he's leaving them. He's going to send another helper. All of the confusion that comes out in the midst of that. I go to prepare a place for you. Where are you going? We don't know where you're going, and we don't know the way. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Somewhere in there, it says at the end of chapter 14 of John, he simply looks to them and says, let's go from here. So that's either anticipating, and many people think, no, he actually leads them out of the upper room at that particular point, and they begin to walk through the temple grounds. And it's in the temple grounds that he points up to something that's on one of the buildings where there was a vine, and he pointed to that and then began to say, I am the vine, you are the branches. And whatever, whether there's a movement, physically location, it's hard to know. Let's go from here, what else that might mean. But then he comes to chapter 17, and in the midst of it, he suddenly stops. And this is one of the only times we're told of in the New Testament that he prays to his Father in the presence of his disciples. They knew he prayed. They'd asked him to teach him to pray. But now he says, Father, and he gives us the great prayer of John chapter 17, which takes us into all that's involved in his purpose and his plan for the church. And most of it's looking off into the future of what he is going to do in that particular way, as they make their way to the Garden of Gethsemane. And then we have Gethsemane itself. Last time we were there, I can remember, maybe it wasn't the last time, but one of the last 2 times we were in Israel, and we came to the Garden of Gethsemane, and we were leading the group and doing it, and all of a sudden as we got there, I just want to need to get off by myself and be by myself. Whether it's almost certainly very close to where the garden would have been at that time. There's some very old olive trees that aren't quite first century, but second or third century. And it just hit me personally that this is where the Lord wrestled with the cost of the cross for himself. This is where it all of a sudden came crushingly in on him. So much so that he even has to ask his disciples to come along and be with me. And of course they fall asleep and leave him, and he's there pictured as sweating, as it were, great drops of blood. If it's possible, let this cup pass from me. And Hebrews talks about him being heard for as much weeping. It must be from to the Garden of Gethsemane, where all of a sudden the full weight of what he'd known all along comes to him emotionally and not just intellectually. And the pressure of all of that just weighs down upon him in the deepest kind of way. And then Thursday ends and we're into Friday and what happens after that with his arrest. So Thursday is a really significant day as we think about what it is. Tuesday was the day outward toward the Jewish leaders and all that they were saying. Thursday is the day inward with his disciples to try and build into them and prepare them and to launch them into what he had that they had no way of knowing, how their world was going to change as a result of what was going to happen in the next 48 hours. Everything was going to be different for them. All their future, all their thinking of who they were, what was going on, not only what they thought they'd lost, but then when the resurrection occurs, of all that now's ahead, that life takes a unbelievably large change. So what hits you as you think about Thursday, as you think about tomorrow and the events of tomorrow? What parts of that stand out to you or are important to you, or you think we need to think about her?
This is a bit of maybe a side question, but we see Jesus instituting the Lord's Supper, and the New Testament church, that's always part of how their church services are ordered and built around. But Jesus also tells him, or says to the disciples, "I'm washing your feet, you should wash other people's." But I don't notice that, or I don't think I've noticed that as something like a command for the church. Is that more of a metaphor, or like of serving each other?
You know, there are some groups who take it as sacramental, something that's required, something that they should do and practice. It hasn't been the conviction of the church, from very early that was given on the same level as the Lord's Supper was, where he explicitly said, do this. And John's the only one that records it, so which makes it sort of significant, but not as central as obviously the Lord's Supper. But I think when he says, do you know what I've done for you? You call me teacher and Lord. By your teacher and Lord wash your feet, you ought to wash one another's feet. But then he goes on to talk about serving and showing love toward one another. It was unthinkable in Jewish society. Even a slave could not be required to wash their master's feet. So for Jesus to wash their feet was entirely countercultural, that he would serve them in that particular way. And part of it is that, and Peter recognizes that you're never going to wash my feet. And I think it was more of an acted parable that this is what humility looks like. This is what service looks like. It's interesting that tomorrow the Pope will have a foot washing service. And he did it with somebody this week. I can't remember, but there was notes about it. But it's interesting when he does it, it's a public display of his humility. I mean, it's flaunting his. I'm not saying him personally, because it's part of the institution. The whole institution flaunts strange things. But so I think the difference is that was more of an acted parable, where the other one was something that was a specific historical reminder of an event. So that's how I kind of think them through as different in their nature. There may be some other ideas here that we should think about. I can remember the first foot washing service I was ever at was down here in California. As a matter of fact, we came down and we were with some of Elizabeth's friends, and they went to a church, and they had, and it must have been Easter week, I think, or preliminary to that, and we went, and they told us ahead of time, but you're very careful before you went to make sure you washed your feet and you didn't have anything dirty that needed to be removed, which is a little bit different than walking through the streets and needing to have your feet washed and do it. And yet there was something meaningful about that. In another church life, we did that in several of our elders when we had a couple of times where elders would get away and we had foot washing service, and it was symbolically meaningful. But I think if you turn it into a symbol, then it begins to, or I mean a regular practice, it begins to lose significance. That's my personal read on it.
The church I grew up in, we did that, and we were taught that we couldn't take communion without doing the foot washing first. So routinely about half the congregation would leave after the sermon before communion because they didn't want to do the foot washing.
This is just a curious question, or a question about my curiosity. When they're at the supper, I don't know what time Peter leans over and says, "Find out who it is that's going to betray," and then he says, "The one I give the sop to." I'm always surprised they didn't just all jump up and grab Judas and wrestle him to the ground or something like that. I mean, that's the normal thing Peter would have done, except that he'd been rebuked a number of times. But I mean, would they really understand that he was being betrayed?
I think
he was betrayed.
I don't think it didn't register at that particular time.
Yeah.
Otherwise, Peter would have been on him like a
Yeah, that's what I
whatever.
think. But there is a psalm that says that my best friend has lifted up his heel against me, talking about David's Ahithophel when he goes and stands with Absalom. So if they had known that, they might have made that connection. But they didn't, obviously.
They obviously learned it, but
Yeah.
at the time when he went out, and the Lord sort of gave him a cover, whatever you're going to do
Yeah, do it
quickly.
just- yeah, okay.
And because he had the money, they thought, well, he was going to give to the poor, which was what so in one sense, the Lord gave him a cover at the same time. He didn't publicly expose him, although he did. But there was others dipping in the sop, and maybe it was disguised enough so it wasn't absolutely clear. Well, I don't know that we need to go on. It's interesting that you have, obviously, the betrayal. We're at that point in the garden as Jesus is in Gethsemane or coming out, met by Judas, and Peter pulls out a sword and manages to take off Malchus's ear. And it's interesting that often the raising of Lazarus is talked about as Jesus' last miracle, but it wasn't. It was the healing of Malchus's ear was Jesus' last miracle prior to his crucifixion. And then there's these series of trials that he has. First of all, you have meeting at Annas, Caiaphas' father-in-law, the former high priest. And then you have the trials, because a trial needed to be held, a capital trial needed to be held on the day of what was going to be an execution day. And of course, and part of the challenge is that Jesus had the Passover meal on Thursday night. John indicates that the lambs were sacrificed on Friday. And that's a bit of a challenge to work through, but it appears that Galileans worked on a different schedule. They had a different calendar, off by one day. So it was a genuine Passover meal, but the main group of them were not going to have Passover until Friday night after the day was over. And Jesus was crucified around the time that the Passover lambs were being slain and prepared for what was going on. So anyway, that night, first of all, Annas, which was not a formal trial, but just a hearing, is where Peter denies the Lord. And then you have the trials, 4 of them. Caiaphas is home, and then they need to get permission for capital execution. Only the Romans had that. That goes to Pilate's. Pilate tries to avoid it at this particular time, especially when there's an appeal to Caesar, or a sense that we'll appeal to Caesar if you don't crucify him. Pilate had his position because of the influence of a man named Sejanus. Sejanus was very close to Tiberius, and Pilate was one of his proteges, and Sejanus had fallen out and had been executed in Rome. So all of his proteges were under some kind of suspicion. And so when they say, we'll go to Caesar, Pilate panics at that stage because he knows this could be dangerous. So he then punts to Herod Antipas, who happens to be in town for Passover, and who is the tetrarch, the Roman official over Galilee, where Jesus is from. And he tries to pass the buck. Herod won't have anything to do with it. He wanted him to do a few miracles, and he wouldn't do them. And so he comes back, and then you have what happens. Herod passes judgment reluctantly. There's the beating of Jesus and the attempt to get sympathy, but they won't settle. Sent to crucifixion, the long walk, and the act of execution takes place at that point, and he's buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, all of those events that we know well. Any of those that we need to think our way through? Okay. Saturday, we know of nothing that happened other than at the end of the Sabbath, the women went out and bought spices for the next night on Saturday night, and then Sunday morning, and we know the events of Easter Sunday morning, although some of the order of some of those events isn't absolutely clear, but nevertheless, we know the main part of that.
Can I ask a question? Does anybody ever criticize Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus for being secret believers?
The question was, does anybody ever criticize Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus for being secret believers? I don't know how to answer that question, sure. And whether it's legitimate or not. The point is, and it's interesting, when they choose to identify themselves as Jesus' followers, when it is, they're identifying with him now that he's clearly an executed criminal. I mean, it's a courageous time to identify. They could have at that point say it's all over and then walk away. Something within them forced them at that particular point. I think it was guilt, conscience, and they weren't expecting a resurrection when they offered to look after his body.
They were believers, both of them.
They were believers of some kind. I mean, he was a disciple secretly. Nicodemus, we only know about from John 3. But well, I know those events are known to you. It's just helpful to me. I was at some point, and actually, as I came in, I didn't answer Richard's question, but he said, Wednesday, what happened on Wednesday? And he was trying to fill his mind with what the calendar of what was happening on this particular time during the week, and it just struck me as useful for me to go back and kind of walk my way through the week and think through all of it, and most of all to take my heart to the cross and remind myself of what the Lord has done for us.